London, Michelin-starred restaurant The Garden. It's a Friday evening when James Harrison, 45 years old, technology magnate with a fortune of $300 million, is dining with his most important business partners to close a $150 million deal. But when young waitress Emily, on her first day of work, accidentally spills wine over his $8,000 Armani jacket, James explodes in front of everyone. "This service is appalling. Who hired this incompetent?" The response from Emily, a 22-year-old girl fresh out of university who works to pay for her master's degree, will leave everyone speechless and forever change the life of London's most arrogant millionaire, teaching him a lesson he will never forget. James Harrison adjusted the platinum cufflinks of his Savile Row shirt while observing with satisfaction the perfectly laid table at The Garden, London's most exclusive Michelin-starred restaurant. At 45, he had built a technology empire worth £300 million, starting from a small software company in his garage in Birmingham. That evening, he had organized a crucial dinner with his most important business partners to finalize the acquisition of an artificial intelligence startup for £150 million. The restaurant epitomized London elegance: baccarat crystal, antique silverware, Irish linen tablecloths, and service that usually functioned like Swiss clockwork. James had chosen The Garden to impress his Japanese guests, Hiroshi Tanaka and Kenji Nakamura from Kyoto Digital Industries, renowned for their attention to detail and protocol. Also present were Robert Thompson, his right-hand man, and solicitor Michael Benedetti, specialist in international acquisitions. James had always had a difficult character, forged by years of ruthless entrepreneurial battles. He was known in London circles for his intransigence, his tendency to publicly humiliate anyone who didn't meet his extremely high standards, and for an arrogance he had developed after achieving success. His employees feared him, competitors respected but detested him, and even his business partners had to endure his outbursts of rage. The evening had begun perfectly. The chef had prepared an exclusive tasting menu. The wines had been selected by the sommelier, and the atmosphere was relaxed. The Japanese seemed satisfied, and negotiations were proceeding in the right direction. James already felt master of the situation, certain that before the end of dinner he would have closed the most important deal of his career. Emily Watson, 22 years old, fresh graduate in economics from Cambridge, had started that day her first shift as a waitress to finance her master's in business administration. She came from a modest family from Manchester, father a factory worker, mother a cleaner. She had studied with scholarships and part-time jobs, graduating with first-class honors but without connections. For her, this job represented a necessary sacrifice to achieve her goals. She was nervous on her first day in such a refined and intimidating environment. She had studied the service protocol, the wine list, the menu dishes, but theory was different from practice. When she was assigned James Harrison's table, she didn't know she was facing the most feared man in London's luxury dining scene. The tragedy unfolded during the second course. Emily was serving the 1985 Bordeaux, a wine costing $500 per bottle, when she stumbled slightly on a small floor unevenness. The bottle slipped from her trembling hands, and part of the precious wine spilled over James's $8,000 Armani jacket, irreparably staining the precious fabric. The silence that fell over the table was deafening. What happened next would forever change both their lives. James's face turned red with rage as he stared at the wine stains spreading across his bespoke jacket. The silence at the table was so heavy you could hear the whispered conversations of other diners. The Japanese business partners observed with wide eyes, while Robert and solicitor Benedetti held their breath, knowing what was about to happen. Emily froze, realizing the enormity of what had occurred. The jacket she had stained was worth more than her father's annual salary. Her hands trembled as she clumsily attempted to dry the wine with the napkin, but James stopped her with a harsh gesture. The explosion was devastating. James leapt up, shouting that the service was appalling, that whoever had hired this incompetent person should be fired immediately. His voice echoed through the elegant environment, attracting the attention of the entire restaurant. He continued his merciless tirade, accusing Emily of incompetence and saying she was ruining a £150 million negotiation. All the diners' eyes were fixed on Emily, some with pity, others with annoyance at being disturbed. The Japanese business partners exchanged embarrassed glances. In their culture, losing control publicly was considered a serious sign of disrespect. James demanded to speak immediately with the manager, wanted Emily fired on the spot. His rage seemed unstoppable, fueled by years of arrogance and the sense of superiority that money had given him. Robert tried discreetly to calm him, but he was already launched into a spiral of fury that seemed endless. Emily, who until that moment had endured the humiliation in silence, felt something snap inside her. It wasn't just anger at the injustice of being treated so harshly for an honest mistake, but also the frustration accumulated over years of sacrifices. Prejudices suffered because of her modest origins. Doors closed despite her merits. The restaurant manager was rushing over, probably ready to apologize and fire Emily to save the establishment's reputation. But before he could reach the table, Emily did something no one expected. With an icy calm that dramatically contrasted with James's hysteria, she straightened up, looked him directly in the eyes, and said with a firm voice, "You're right, sir. It was a serious mistake, and I take full responsibility. But what would you say if I told you that your reaction says far more about who you are as a person than my mistake says about me as a worker?" The restaurant plunged into absolute silence. James stood open-mouthed, not believing what he heard. The one he considered a simple, incompetent waitress had just dared to challenge him publicly. Emily continued speaking with a confidence that surprised everyone, herself included. The initial fear had transformed into cold and lucid determination, fed by years of injustices suffered, and the awareness that she had nothing left to lose. She explained that she knew who James was, had studied his successes for her dissertation. She recognized him as a brilliant and visionary man who had built an empire from nothing. But what she had seen that evening wasn't a leader, but a spoiled child who had lost control over a wine stain. Her words cut through the air like blades. Emily observed that the real problem of the country wasn't the mistakes of those who worked honestly, but the arrogance of those who thought money gave them the right to humiliate others. It was the inability to recognize people's value beyond their social position. The Japanese guests followed the scene with growing interest. In their culture, the courage to speak truth to power was deeply respected, even when it came from a subordinate position. Emily continued explaining that yes, she had spilled wine, and would pay every penny to replace the jacket, even if it meant working a whole year. But James, in 5 minutes of shouting, had ruined his reputation in front of people he respected and with whom he wanted to do business. He had proved to be the type of man who humiliates waiters, believing that economic power gives the right to treat others badly. Her analysis became even more incisive when she observed that probably James would return home complaining about the difficulty of finding competent staff, without ever asking himself if the problem wasn't the way he treated people. The restaurant manager had arrived but had stopped at a distance, fascinated by this surreal scene. Never had he seen someone confront James Harrison so publicly. Emily removed her apron and placed it on the table with slow and deliberate gestures. She explained that she was there because she worked to pay for a master's degree, to build her future with her own strength. She asked James where he was at 22. Did he already have everything served on a silver platter? Or did he too have to fight for every opportunity? The question hit James like a punch in the stomach. He knew very well where he came from. From a modest family in Birmingham, father a mechanic, and mother a seamstress. He had started selling computers in the garage at home, working 18 hours a day for years. Emily concluded her intervention with a dignity that left everyone speechless, apologizing for the incident and bidding farewell to everyone before walking away with her head held high under the eyes of the entire restaurant. Hiroshi Tanaka was the first to break the silence. With a slight bow towards James, he observed that this young woman had demonstrated more leadership in 5 minutes than many executives show in an entire career. James remained seated, staring at the spot where Emily had disappeared, while her words continued echoing in his mind. The restaurant had gradually regained its normal atmosphere, but at their table the climate was glacial. Hiroshi Tanaka sipped his sake and looked at James with a thoughtful expression. He quoted a Japanese saying about how a man's true character is revealed in the way he treats those who cannot harm him, adding that they had seen much of James's character that evening. The Japanese businessman's words were like a cold shower. James immediately understood that the negotiation was compromised.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
Kenji Nakamura added that the Japanese believed greatly in mutual respect, humility, and self-control, fundamental values for doing business with their culture. Robert desperately tried to save the situation by attributing James's reaction to stress, but Hiroshi interrupted him gently but firmly. He explained that what they had seen wasn't stress, but a man who had revealed his true nature when he thought he had absolute power over someone else. James felt his world collapsing. This negotiation represented his company's future, the opportunity to compete with global technology giants, and everything was evaporating because of a wine stain and his uncontrolled reaction. But more than the economic consequences, Emily's words tormented him. Every sentence was like a mirror reflecting aspects of himself he had preferred to ignore. Had he really become the type of man who humiliated waiters? When had he stopped remembering his humble origins? Solicitor Benedetti attempted a last rescue by proposing to postpone the discussion, but Hiroshi shook his head. He explained that they had to reconsider the partnership because they couldn't associate their company's name with someone who treated employees and collaborators that way. Kenji added the final blow by observing that the young waitress was right and had shown more leadership in 5 minutes than many CEOs demonstrate in years. She had made them reflect on the values they sought in a business partner. The two Japanese rose with polite formality and headed towards the exit. James watched them leave, realizing he had lost the most important deal of his life for failing to control his character in front of a 22-year-old girl. Robert and the solicitor remained silent, not knowing what to say. When Robert suggested leaving, James replied that he had something to do first. He had to find Emily. He had to speak with her. He didn't know what he wanted to tell her, but he knew he couldn't leave things like that. He asked the manager where Emily was, ordering not to fire her until he had spoken with her. James waited outside the staff changing rooms for what seemed like hours. When Emily emerged, wearing her civilian clothes, a simple blue jumper and jeans, she looked much younger and more vulnerable than she had appeared during their confrontation. She saw him and stopped, clearly surprised to find him there. James asked her to give him 5 minutes to talk. Emily looked at him with suspicion, thinking he had come to tell her how inappropriate she had been, but admitting she didn't regret it. James surprised her completely by declaring he wasn't there for that, but because she was right about everything. The words came out of his mouth before he even realized it. Emily looked at him incredulously, as if she had witnessed a miracle. Guessing that his Japanese guests had left, Emily showed regret, knowing how important that deal was. James confirmed they had cancelled the negotiation. 120 million pounds lost because of a stained jacket and his awful character. They sat on a bench in the small rear courtyard of the restaurant. James began telling how he had started, exactly like her, at 22, coming from a working-class family and working in a garage. He remembered perfectly what it meant to be badly treated by wealthy customers, to be looked down upon, He explained that when he began to have success, he had sworn never to become like those who had humiliated him, but instead, he had become worse than all of them combined. He had spent the last 10 years convincing himself that success gave him the right to treat others badly, that being feared was the same as being respected. Emily remained silent, then observed that during her dissertation she had studied many successful entrepreneurs, discovering that the best were those who never forgot where they came from and treated employees like family, not like enemies. When James asked her how she could be so wise at 22, Emily replied that perhaps it was thanks to parents who had taught her that respect is earned through actions, not money, and because she had had to fight for every opportunity, knowing how important it was for someone to believe in you. James looked at her with new eyes. This girl whom he had humiliated in front of the entire restaurant had not only forgiven him, but was offering him a life lesson worth more than any business school course. Suddenly, he asked her about the university she wanted to attend. When Emily explained it was Cambridge for an MBA in international business, but that after that evening she didn't know if she could afford it, James interrupted her by offering to pay for the master's and promising her a position in his company once finished. Emily looked at him incredulously, but James set one condition, that when she was in his company, if she ever saw him treat anyone badly, she would stop him exactly as she had done that evening. Emily extended her hand with a smile that lit up the entire courtyard, accepting the agreement. 2 years after that fateful evening, James Harrison's office was unrecognizable. The walls once decorated only with corporate awards now housed employee photos, best place to work certifications, and a board dedicated to team successes. But the biggest change was in the man himself. Emily had finished her MBA with first-class honors, and James had hired her as Junior Business Development Manager. In 2 years, the corporate philosophy had radically changed. Employees no longer feared the CEO, but genuinely respected him. Turnover had dropped to 0. Productivity had increased by 40%, and the company had attracted the sector's best talent. That Friday afternoon, Emily entered the office with important news. Hiroshi Tanaka wanted to see him again. Kyoto Digital Industries was interested in resuming negotiations, impressed by the company's evolution over the past 2 years. James smiled, but it wasn't the arrogant smile of before. When he asked Emily what she thought, she replied they were ready, but above all that he was no longer the man he had been 2 years ago. The changes in James had been profound. He lunched in the company canteen with employees, knew the names of collaborators' children, had instituted scholarships for deserving young people from modest families, and above all, he had learned to apologize when he made mistakes. Reflecting on that evening at the restaurant, James observed that he had lost a $120 million deal, but had gained something priceless. He had found himself again, the Birmingham lad who had started everything to prove you could succeed while remaining a good person. That evening, they decided to return to the garden, not for business, but for a quiet dinner with the team. James wanted to prove to himself that he had truly changed. When he entered the restaurant, the manager recognized him immediately. James asked for a normal table, not the reserved one, and inquired about Emily, the waitress from 2 years ago. The manager confirmed she had become one of their most beautiful success stories. James smiled, observing that she had also become his success story. During dinner, while watching the staff work with professionalism and dignity, James thought back to that evening that had changed everything. A wine stain had been the catalyst for a transformation he would never have believed possible. Emily, noticing him lost in thought, asked what he was thinking about. James replied that he was reflecting on how sometimes it takes a brave 22-year-old girl to remind an arrogant millionaire what values really matter. Emily replied that sometimes it takes a humble millionaire to demonstrate that everyone can change if they have the courage to admit their mistakes. That evening, James left a generous tip for all the staff, not for show, but in recognition of their work. As he left the restaurant, he realized that true success isn't measured in millions earned, but in lives changed for the better, starting with one's own. The following Monday, when Hiroshi Tanaka arrived in London, he found a completely different man from the one 2 years before. A man who had learned that true power doesn't lie in humiliating others, but in elevating them. This time the deal was concluded with economic success, mutual respect, and a partnership destined to last. Emily, promoted to Business Development Director, led the negotiations, demonstrating that talent, when recognized and cultivated, can transform not only companies, but people's lives. If this story moved you, leave a like, share in the comments. Have you ever had the courage to stand up to someone powerful? Do you believe people can really change? Subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories that show how a moment of courage can change everything. Remember, true success isn't measured by your bank balance, but by the respect you have for yourself and others. Sometimes all it takes is one brave person to remind us who we really want to be.